So with this motion, we're going to address why we think that actually having this policy and having the motion that we will actually push more on having moral values in comparison to actually pushing on actual tangible policies will actually be more beneficial, will benefit the country more, and will lead to more successful outcomes for the opposing parties in the first place. Okay, now let's just go on to my framing. So basically, our framing and our characterization of this is that opposing parties will have the same policies as the current parties who are already in power, because those are the policies that got these parties into powers in the first place. However, the main difference that actually sets them apart from the reigning parties is that they'll push more on morality, such as being transparent, having no corruption, and actually being a more honest party in general. So first of all, before we begin, why do we think that dominant parties are dominant in the first place, and how can opposing parties actually use this to their advantage? So we think that the whole reason why dominant parties became dominant in the first place is because, of course, of their very popular policies and their popular politicians, right? But we think that as much as the policies are popular and as much as they can be benevolent as they want to, we think that actually having a party in power for a long time will first of all be, of course, monopolization, and it can eventually most likely turn back, which I'm going to actually explain more about later. So we think that why dominant parties are dominant in the first place are because of these policies, and we're not going to change anything about that, about the opposing parties. So the opposing parties are going to have the exact same policies, but they're not actually going to push about these policies as it's already there in status quo. Instead, they're going to push on the fact that they're more benevolent, they're more honest, and they have less corruption in compared to the leading party. Okay, so now let's move on to my main point. So in my speech, I'm going to be talking about monopolization, why we think that dominant parties become bad, and how opposing parties can actually use it to their advantage, and why is it beneficial to actually push on the idea of being honest in the first place. Okay, so now onto my first point of monopolization. Why do we think that dominant parties become bad in the first place? So as kind of explained and put up in my characterization in the first part of my speech, we think that dominant parties become bad, like most of them become bad because it's not because they are meant to be bad. It's not because they were destined to be bad. It's because when a party is in power for way too long, we think that this can eventually lead, in most cases, to a party having corruption, to a party having policies that will not benefit the democracy as a whole. So we think that this is a bad thing, and it's the reason why we have term limits in the first place. But we think that the whole reason and the whole idea of monopolization on dominant parties becoming bad, and the whole idea that once they stay in power, once they feel like they have unchecked power, they basically have the freedom to do anything they want. They have the power to have whatever corruption they want. They can use their power to their advantage, and this is something that opposing parties, of course, do not want, right? So we think that opposing parties can really push on the motion that they are more benevolent and they don't have these issues that the reigning parties have, right? And to preempting on what if they become bad, that's something that my DPM will expand on later. Okay, so now why do we think that it's beneficial that we push on the idea of being honest? So we think that this is a very good tactic, and we think that it's actually very effective in the case that people will generally take down a party once they find out that they've been embroiled in a scandal, that they have been doing things that are dishonest, that they have been engaged in nefarious activities, right? So we think that a lot of this idea of how they become bad and how opposition parties can actually use that to their advantage is like the big push of why it's beneficial for them to actually push on the idea that they're more honest and they're more moral in the first place. So like if you take the example of 1MDB, right? So like Najib's policies, he got voted in the first place because he was quite popular with the people, right? His policies were good. They were not horrendous, right? And he got voted in for a reason. But like once they found out that he was embroiled in a scandal, of course opposing parties and opposing politicians took this to their advantage to actually bring on the idea that I am more honest, I'm more benevolent, but in comparison to them, we have the same policies. But what you will get is you will get honesty, you'll get transparency, which is something we believe that that opposing parties should actually really push on. So before I summarize everything, let me just go through what I've said again. So basically I've talked about monopolization and how we think that dominant parties become bad and why we believe believe that this is not only good, just not only for the opposing parties, but we think that it's also good for the democracy as a whole. So we think that, of course, there are like two main stakeholders in this debate, right? There's the opposition, there's the opposing parties that, of course, want to compete for a spot to become the main government, and we think that there's another stakeholder that we also have to acknowledge are the democracy and the people as a whole. So we think that other than just being in power, we think that these opposing parties can actually do good. They can actually do good with the fact that these reigning parties do not have uncontrolled power anymore. So we think that other than the fact that they can do good, other than the fact that they can get rid of this monopoly in the government, that they can actually have some check power in a democracy, which is the whole point of the democracy in the first place. We think that it's really beneficial to push on the idea of being honest. Okay, so now before I finish, I'd just like to summarize everything that we've brought today. So basically, we've characterized how opposing parties will have the exact same policies, as this is what the people want in the first place, right? They want the policies, but they don't want the corruption. And also, we've talked about why dominant parties become dominant in the first place. It's because of their policies. We've talked about why monopolization is bad, and how a lot of reigning parties actually become bad because they've been in power for too long, and how that can actually be an issue for the democracy as a whole. And we've also talked about why it's really beneficial for basically opposing parties to actually push on the idea that they're being honest and actually taking down the reigning party by pointing out their moral shortcomings. So as a whole, we think that this is something that as the actor of the opposing party is really beneficial and is in the best interest of these parties to do. And with that, I can conclude.